In this video, I will be taking the parts of the base mesh that have the stone tag and generating the high poly detail. I'll start by adding a blast, and under the group here, you can see here I've got this tag attribute and the option for either metal or stone. And first of all, I'm going to create the kind of stone high poly section. I've selected stone, but I'm seeing the metal, and that's because it's blasting the stone section away. So let's invert that by hitting delete non-selected. And there we go. I'm now left with just the stone section of the tombstone. So let's just rename this blast to stone. The first thing I want to do is remesh this geometry using the remesh to grid node. And so what this would do is convert this object to a volume and then convert that volume to geometry. Currently it's very low res and looking a bit kind of smooth and marshmallowy, so let's decrease this division size, which will increase the resolution. So I'm going to choose, let's say 0.03. That's a bit better. Let's do 0.01. There we go, that's a bit nicer. You can see if things are a bit faceted here, and we've got some harsh edges. So what I'm going to do is just increase the smooth iterations from 0 to 1. So that smoothed these areas out a little bit, but I want it to look almost a little bit beveled. So what actually I'm going to do is just slightly erode this VDB. So I'm going to put a small value. That's a bit too high. It's just to 0.005, minus 0.005. And that's just going to slightly erode the surface. So it just looks a bit more beveled rather than smoothed. And now what I want to use is a mountain node, which is an attribute noise. And with this first noise, I just want to create some kind of damaged areas to the surface of this stone. Now, this mountain noise is currently doing quite a lot of displacement. So I'm just going to turn down the amplitude from 0.25 to something really small, say 0.005. And I'm going to turn down the element size to something quite small as well, say 0.1. So now if I just turn off wireframe, which I just did using Shift W, or you can do it from the menu up here. See, you've just got some kind of subtle noise going on. And I am going to enable remap ramp. So let's just adjust this ramp. As I do that, you can see we kind of have these chipped out areas. Just change the noise type from simplex to Perlin flow. Now I'm just going to increase this remesh grid value a little bit more, so I've got more resolution to work with. Let's try 0.005. There we go, that's a bit sharper now. I'm going to try increasing the resolution a little bit further and reduce this from 0.005 to 0.003. There we go, now you can see I've got some bit more detail on these kind of chipped areas. It's giving us some weird results on these kind of corner areas, and so to smooth that out, what I'm going to do between the remesh grid and the mountain node, the attribute noise, we're going to add in a normal node. And I'm going to change this from vertices to points. And then after that, add an attribute blur. And I don't want to blur the position, this P attribute, so I'm going to delete that and instead add the normal attribute and increase this all the way up to 100. So when I did that, you can see it looks like it smoothed out this geometry, and what it's actually done, the geometry itself hasn't changed. I turn on wireframe. What it's doing is smoothing and blurring out the normals. So if I visualize these point normals here, that's quite a lot of them. So I'm just going to turn this down to 0.03 temporarily. As I change this blur iteration, you can see it's smoothing out that normal direction. Just disable that display normals and return that division size to 0.003. Now when I look at the mountain node, these areas don't look quite so harsh. Now I want to add another attribute noise, another mountain node. And I'm just going to use this to add some kind of subtle noise, some subtle stone texture to the surface of this geometry. So with this mountain node, again, I'm going to turn this amplitude down to something really small, to say 0.001, and again enable remap, and then expand this fractal, increase this in roughness to something quite high, let's say 0.9. There we go. We've now got a much rougher noise, and that's because it's just subtly showing up on this geometry. I'm just going to remap it slightly. You see currently it's quite slow dragging this remap, because every time I drag this slider, it's changing and updating the viewport. So I'm just going to change this from auto update down here to on mouse up. So now you can see I move this much more freely. The viewport isn't updating, but once I let go of the mouse, then it updates in the viewport. So let's break this up. Just adjust this a little bit. I'm also going to come back to the previous attribute noise. Also increase the roughness on this one as well. So let's expand fractal, increase this to say 0.6. That's also just roughened up these kind of damaged areas a little bit as well. So the next thing I want to do is add some edge damage to kind of break up and damage these edges and the corners of the stone. And to do that, I'm going to use the labs edge damage. This node also works with the voxel remesh, so this node will also convert the geometry to a volume with VDB. You can see here method VDB, and then we'll create some geometry which you can use to boolean and cut off kind of the edges and corners of the geometry. You can see here we have, under voxelization, we have an option to increase the voxel resolution. Once this finishes cooking, you'll see that it'll be quite low resolution at 0.01. And here under damage controls, we control the amount of damage that we have, and then we can increase the resolution of the geometry that is used to boolean off the kind of damaged areas. So there we go. As I said, it's low resolution at the moment with a voxel size of 0.01. But we can see some of that edge damage. So as I increase this edge damage, more and more of the stone gets kind of broken and damaged, or you can decrease it and have less damage. Let's leave it at 3, and I'm going to increase the resolution of the damage to 0.8 and just let that cook. So that's giving us a little bit more detail on this damaged area. And you can see over here we have some noise options as well. So the noise is what drives the damage. So if I was to change the element size or the roughness, that will change the noise roughness of this damage. So it's looking a little bit more extreme now that I've increased the resolution. So I'm going to just play with some of the values until I get something that I kind of like the look of. So you can see as I increase this height here, or decrease the height, it is affecting how much gets chipped away. It's a bit too subtle. Let's try 0.5 again on the height. I'm going to increase the element size as well, try 0.8. Yeah, I'm happy with that. These are meant to be kind of old tombstones that have been there, standing there for a long time. The weather's kind of worn away, so I want them to look fairly damaged. Saying decrease the damage amount to 2 as well. And now that I'm kind of happy with that look, I'm going to increase this voxel size. This will take longer to cook now that I'll increase this voxel resolution. Something to bear in mind, here we have the remesh set to 0.003. So what I want to do is just choose a value which is just slightly less than that. So I'm going to choose 0.0025. And by doing that, we should mean we retain all of the detail from these two attribute noise nodes. So there we go, now we've got a much higher resolution mesh. We are getting some loss in detail. We look at the 2, and I think that's because we've got these smooth iterations here. So I'm going to turn off the smooth by turning it 0 to see whether or not we get more detail back into the geometry. And that indeed has got us a little bit more detail back, which is what I want. I'm still seeing some faceting in the kind of edge damage area, so I'm going to increase the damage controls resolution to 1. Okay, that looks a lot nicer now. We haven't got quite so much kind of low poly faceting in the damage areas. So now the last thing to do is I want some moss growing on the surface of this stone. So for the moss, I want it to be growing on a few different surfaces, and I want some kind of variation. So I want moss growing mostly on the top areas of the tombstone. I want to have more moss growing on one side than the other, just to give the impression that maybe one area is um, facing the sun or is getting more moisture or more rain, and so more moss is kind of growing on one side or the other, just to add a bit of visual variation. And then also I want to have more moss growing on the top surfaces than I do kind of on the sides and underneath. So what I'll do is I'll build a few different masks that I can then use to create this moss. Just to speed up working, what I'm going to do is just drop down a remesh grid node to temporarily lower the resolution of this tombstone. Try 0.01. There we go, that'll make things kind of quicker and easier to work with. What you could do as well is drop this inside a subnet. So just with the remesh grid node, click this little cardboard box icon, and that will convert the selection to a subnet. Now I'm going to call this moss. And then double click and we'll jump inside. Let's just give us plenty of space to work with. So the first thing I'm going to add is a mask by feature. And what this will do is allow us to create some masks based on a few different methods. We can create a method by direction, by shadow, casting a light from a certain direction, and anywhere that light doesn't reach will be used as a mask, or we can create a mask by ambient occlusion. And then there are some controls to remap and adjust those values. I'm going to uncheck cast shadows, and we're just going to use this direction to create the mask. If we come up to this little symbol here on the right of the mask and click that, that will create a visualizer for this attribute, this mask attribute. And actually, if you come down into this icon at the bottom of this toolbar and right click, this is where it's created that visualizer for the mask attribute. And we've got some controls here. You can kind of adjust the direction here. So if I change this from 0 in the Y direction, so this is X, Y, Z, and put a 1, value of 1 in the first field, this is now creating a mask in the X direction, so in the positive X. I'm going to switch back to 1 in the Y channel and 0 in X, and hovering over the viewport, if I hit enter, that'll bring up the gizmo, and that will allow me to adjust the direction of this mask, so we can see updating here. I've still got on mouse up enabled, so I'm just going to switch that back to auto update, so now I can see this updating in real time. As I said before, I want to just bias on one side to have more moss kind of growing on one side than the other. So I'm just going to tilt this back slightly and maybe tilt it a little bit to the right as well, just slightly. So there we go. Now we just have a bit more, more moss growing on the back, just to add a bit more visual variation. I'm also going to increase this max angle as well to say 140. Okay. Now I'm going to add a point FOP. So the next thing I want to do is add a mask that will add, which I can use to add more moss to the kind of top upper areas of the geometry and have less kind of growing on the bottom where it's close to the ground. So inside this point FOP, just double click to open it up. Let's give us a bit more space to see what we're dealing with. And from the position, I'm going to add a relative to bounding box. Now if I add this to color, and just disable that mask, just make sure we've got that point FOP selected. And here you can see we've got some color gradients in different areas of the mesh. And if I add a vector to float to split up the different color channels, and now you can see in the red channel I've got a gradient along the x-axis. In the green channel I've got a gradient in the y-axis, and in the blue channel a gradient along the z-axis. And I want a gradient in the y direction that's from top to bottom, so let's reconnect the green channel back to color. And there we can see that gradient from top to bottom. I want to be able to adjust this gradient, so I'm going to add a ramp parameter. And now if I just come back up to this point FOP, you can see I've got this ramp here. To actually change that ramp from RGB color ramp to a spline ramp. Come back up again, and now we've got this spline ramp. Just need to adjust it slightly. And now I can adjust this ramp. Don't want to do too much to it. Just slightly increase the value at the top end. So I want to use this ramp with the previous mask that I created from the direction. So to do that, let's just disconnect this from color. I'm going to add a bind node. And so what this does is this will bind an attribute. I'm essentially just importing the attribute into the point FOP so that we can manipulate it. I want the mask attribute, and I'm going to multiply this, so add a multiply with this ramp. So let's add that ramp to the second input of the multiply. Just give it some more space. And then export this again using a bind export. And again, we're exporting the mask attribute. Just enable that mask again. And if we just look at the back area, just adjust this, you can see I'm adjusting that vertical ramp. So and that's combined, multiplied with the mask by direction. So you can see it's kind of cut off the areas at the bottom here. So we'll get more moss growing at the top, on the top surfaces on the back, and less moss growing at the bottom. So now I want to create the kind of moss areas, a noise that I can use to kind of create clumps of moss. So I'm going to add a noise, an attribute noise. And if I just disable the visualizer, we can see currently this is creating a noise on using the color attribute. But I can actually use this, but I don't want to create an attribute on the color. I want to create it on the mask attribute. So let's change this to a float, delete the color attribute, and then if we click the this little arrow, we can see that mask attribute. Let's re-enable the visualizer, and there we can see we've got some noise, and that's actually being added to the previous values that are on this attribute. So that's being added to this mask. I'm going to change the operation from add to subtract and enable remap ramp, and then adjust it just so that we have more contrast. Now the attribute noise is creating values that are greater than a value of 1. So I'm going to come down to post process and check minimum and maximum to clamp the values between a value of 0 and 1. And as I adjust this remap ramp, you can see I'm revealing more or less of that underlying mask. I'm going to expand fractal and increase this roughness a little bit. So we've got more detail. Actually, let's just change this from linear to smooth. So that'll give us a bit more of a smoother fall off to this noise. Currently this noise is quite large, so I'm going to decrease this element size. Let's try 0.4. Okay, I think that's going to work nicely. See, we've got some values down here on the mask, some on the back, and then kind of it being stronger on the top, which is what I want. Now I just want to pause for a moment and just consider how this will work when I'm applying to kind of the small tombstones and the larger ones. So I've now got 3 boxes, this large, medium, and small. I'm going to connect this small box to the remesh grid, and then just make this attribute noise visible. And temporarily I'm just going to switch this operation from subtract to add, just so we can see the noise a little bit clearer. And something I want to consider is how moss grows. It kind of grows in kind of large clumps. So we're going to have some small areas which are kind of nice to add some breakup, but then we also have these kind of large clumps. I want to check that the look of the moss is consistent across the various sizes of props. So I'm going to attach this medium-sized box. And it looks okay, but we do start to see more breakup in the noise. If I attach the largest box, we can now see we've got quite a lot of visual noise across the surface. And if there's too much visual noise, it can often look distracting and unnatural. So we can make this even bigger, visualize this noise. And so as you can see, the larger the object gets, the more noise we can see across the surface, and I think this is just going to be too distracting. To keep the noise a uniform scale, I'm going to add a match size before the attribute noise. And on the match size, I'm going to check scale to fit. So this will fit the object within this bounding box, which is currently set to a target size of 1 by 1 by 1. So I'll visualize the noise. Let's increase this match size to a box that's 10 by 10. That's going to make this much bigger. And then on the attribute noise, I'm going to set the element size to 1. So now when I switch between these boxes, the noise is going to be more uniform regardless of the size of the box. So I've scaled up the box, but now I need to scale it down. And so what I'm going to do is on the match size, I'm going to check stash transforms. And that will store the transform information on an attribute called xform. And then after the attribute noise, I can add another match size, and this time check restore transforms. And this will restore the transform information that's stored on that XForm attribute. And now if I switch between these cubes whilst visualizing that second match size, we can see we've got a uniform amount of noise regardless of the size of the object. So when I use the different props, which are different sizes, we should get a much nicer distribution of moss. So just reconnect the input from the subnetwork, delete those cubes now that I've finished with that demonstration, and switch the attribute noise back to subtract. Now after the match size, I'm going to add an attribute remap, and I want to remap the mask attribute. Just make that attribute remap visible, and then as I remap these values, we can see them becoming stronger. So this will be the areas that the moss is appearing on. I want a little bit more moss, so I'm going to come back to the mask by feature and increase this max angle to 180. And that's just expanded that moss area a little bit further. I also want to add a little bit more detail to the moss, so I'm going to come back to the attribute noise, and under fractal increase the max octaves from 3 to 8. And now we can see we've got more detail in that moss mask. After the attribute remap, I'm going to add an attribute blur, and I want to blur the mask attribute. And before I adjust the blur iterations, I'm just going to want to come up and disable that remesh grid. And then increase the blur iterations on the attribute blur to 20. There we go, so that's going to soften out the edges of that mask. I'm going to add another attribute remap. Again, remapping the mask. And I'm going to change this to round. Let's adjust this. So all I want is kind of a nice smooth curve here. Go just bulges at the top. And then after the attribute remap, add a soft peak. And with this, we're going to use, for the distance metric, an attribute. And the distance attribute is going to be that mask attribute. And now, as I increase this distance, so I've just set it to 0.1, but you can see what that's done. That's kind of pushed the masked areas out from the surface of the geometry. It's quite extreme, so let's turn that down to say 0.02. And we can see you've got some intersecting here going on. So I'm going to do a similar trick to what I did before, is add a normal node before the soft peak, switch it to points, and then add an attribute blur, and blur the normal attribute. And increase the blur iterations to 100. So that's softened the normals and removed some of that intersection. And we've now got some kind of moss areas bulging and growing on the surface of our geometry, but there's some areas where the surface is a little bit uniform, a little bit flat. So I'm going to add another mounted node. And this time I'm going to check blend. And rather than using a constant to blend, I'm going to use an attribute. And the default value is set to mask, which is what we have. We have an attribute called mask. And so you can see it's adding that noise area to the masked areas. Again, it's a bit extreme, so let's turn this down. Let's set this amplitude to 0.02. And turn down the element size as well. Change it to 0.2. And under fractal, just increase the roughness a little bit. 0.6 is a bit much. Let's try 0.5. There we go. That's just added a little bit of surface noise to the moss. Now, the last thing I want to do at the end of this network is I want to sharpen up this mask attribute. So I softened it so that I had a nice round fall off when I used the soft peak to extrude the moss from the surface of the geometry. But now I want to sharpen it up so I can bake it to a map and use it in Unreal to blend between the moss and the stone material. So at the end here, I'm going to add another attribute remap. I'm going to remap that mask attribute and decrease the input max until that mask is mostly covering the moss area. And there's still some kind of light, soft areas, so I'm now just going to increase this input minimum as well. So that will kind of cut out those areas. And to make adjusting this a bit easier, I'm going to copy parameter from the input min and paste relative reference into the input max. And then type plus 0.1. And now if I just left click on the input max label, and as I adjust this, you can see it's always going to be 0.1 difference between these two sliders. In fact, I might just decrease that to plus 0.05. And I'm going to set the input min to 0.15. There we go, I think that's going to work nicely. So this will be the mask that will blend between the stone and the moss material. So let's come back up to our geometry node. And we've got our moss subnet. I want to store this mask in the red channel of a color attribute. So I'm just going to disable this visualizer and then add an attribute wrangle. And in here, I'm going to type @cd equals 0. So that's going to create a color attribute, but the values will all be 0, so the color will be black. And now I want to place that mask attribute into the red channel. So I'm going to type @cd.r for the red channel is equal to @mask for the mask attribute, followed by a semicolon. And now you can see that mask attribute stored in the red channel. But I actually want to invert this. I want the stone to be red and the moss area to be black. And to do that, I'm going to use an expression called fit0. So in the attribute wrangle, before the mask attribute, I'm going to type fit01, open brackets. And just read what this says. It takes the value in the range of 0 to 1 and shifts it to the corresponding value in the new range. So the input for this is a value followed by the minimum and the maximum value that you want to remap it to. And so I actually want to remap this mask attribute from 0 to 1 to 1 to 0 to invert it. So I'm going to type comma 1 comma 0 close bracket. And there we go, that's now inverted that mask. So we now have the stone areas appearing as red. That concludes the setup for the high poly stone. Next, I'm going to set up the high poly metal material.